Hi, everyone. Dr. Giobbi back with you on our third installment of psychoanalytic analysis of the media. And today I'm going to be discussing with you from 182 on, which is applying the techniques to media analysis based on the theoretical models of Freud and Lacan that we had mentioned. I'm going to, so in doing this, I'm also teaching you, demonstrating to you how to read, especially a difficult theoretical text. I would suggest, like we did with the first half of this chapter, to go to the final paragraph or to the area that wraps up the section and read that along with the first paragraph or two, the introduction to the section. So let's read the first section on 182 to see where we're going. And then we'll read the last paragraph to see a recap of the whole section before we move on to the individual aspects of that. So it says, this is 182. Scholars in this tradition draw on a number of different theoretical foundations when attempting to understand films and other forms of media, but most agree on a few overriding principles. First, some media texts are structured in such a way that they activate or otherwise tap into unconscious drives. Now, the unconscious is really the hallmark of the psychodynamic movement. A little comment on the word psychodynamic. When you refer to Freud, classic Freudian analysis, that's typically called psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic. Psychodynamic is broadly anything that, including Freud and anything that comes after Freud. So technically speaking, Lacan is a psychodynamic theorist. Freud is a psychoanalytic theorist. What Freud does is psychoanalysis. Now, what I'm proposing to you, of course, is from the position, I was taught from this position by a Freudian, so this is, the Freudians are very proud of their tradition, so psychoanalysis is, they consider that to be only Freudian. So I just want you to be aware that there is, among some thinkers, depending where you're at, there's a distinction between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic. So first, some media texts are structured in such a way that they activate or otherwise tap into the unconscious. So the unconscious is really the big, it's the psychology of the unconscious is what psychoanalysis is all about, or psychodynamic depth psychology. When we watch a movie or gaze at an advertisement, gaze, that's an important word, G-A-Z-E, the gaze. We do so because it allows us to experience the parts of ourselves that are there but not consciously known. In Freudian terms, this means that some media are constructed in such a way that allows us to indulge in repressed or socially prohibited pleasures. From a Lacanian perspective, this means that the structure of some media allows us to overcome a lack and access the imagery, the imaginary pleasures which language divides from our conscious mind. Now, if you remember, for Lacan, there's always this state of desire, and desire is a lack. We're always in a position of feeling that something is lacking that needs to be fulfilled for Lacan. And in Lacanian media analysis, the film fulfills that need temporarily. The advertisement, what is the desire, the need that's being promised, fulfillment. And what's often described, especially in advertising, that advertising functions much like critics of religious belief discuss the features that what is invented is a problem by the structure. The advertisement creates a problem, a dilemma, just like a religion would, and then offers a solution to the problem. So the problem, the solution that's being suggested is built on a problem that is also being suggested by the same manufacturers. Perhaps it is helpful overall to consider such texts as a tool for temporarily undermining the hold of the reality principle and allowing pleasure principle a bit more reign over our psyche. So it says, perhaps it is helpful overall to consider such texts as a tool for temporarily undermining the hold of the reality principle and allowing the pleasure principle. So by watching the film, by looking at the whatever the ad is promising, under the subtext is promising. This is what we're looking at is satisfying this unconscious desire that it's a wish fulfillment, just like a dream is a wish fulfillment. It's satisfying some need that's going unsatisfied in our waking reality. So this is the pleasure machine. This machine, this video, this movie is tapping directly into the pleasure principle, directly into the fantasy, into the phantasm, we'll look into whatever it is you watch repeatedly and enjoy repeatedly. What is the underlying thing that's being fulfilled by that film? Okay, so that's the first paragraph. Let's look at the conclusion. This chapter has looked at how psychoanalytic concepts... One moment. That's a conclusion for the whole chapter. Yeah. This chapter has looked at how psychoanalytic concept of drive helps explain the structure of media technologies and texts, with film as the historically predominant area for analysis. Psychoanalytic theorists Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan provide a somewhat overlapping understanding of the formative process that results in an individual's psychical structure, and their respective theories of repression and desire each help shed light on why films and other forms of media appeal to audiences based on this mental formation. The three approaches, so this is what we're now going to discuss. The three approaches to film outlined in this chapter: apparatus theory, theories of the male gaze, and fantasy theory, all attempt to explain how the early structuring of human mind results in the particular management of film in society, filmic evolution, screening, shot sequences, and characterization, narratives, and so on. Contemporary scholars have extended these approaches by questioning their assumptions about the nature of gender, sexuality, and desire, resulting in a small but vibrant field of psychoanalytic research today. Through those psychoanalytic approaches to media texts are not as popular as they were in the 70s and the 80s. Psychoanalytic scholars continue to present the field of media studies with a fascinating synthesis of psychology with books, films, television, and the internet. If nothing else, psychoanalysis provides us with the multifaceted interpretation of the psyche, an important perspective on contemporary media, and a language to articulate that at times inexplicable attraction we feel towards popular texts. Okay. So that is where we're going, and a recap. So we looked at, like when you write a paper, your introduction and your conclusion. We read the introduction and the conclusion. This is exactly how I recommend you write a paper. You write the paper and you get the meat of it. Then you read that and see, where did I go? And you write the conclusion. This is where we've been, a recap of that. And then you write an introduction to that. You can't write an introduction unless you know what you're about to write. So we did this in reverse in the reading. We read the introduction, we read the conclusion. Now we're going to get into, we know what we're dealing with, what's on our plate. Now let's start cutting it up and macerating it. Okay, I'm going to look at here. One of the main concepts is phallocentrism. Uh, Phallocentrism is a social condition where images or representations of the penis carry connotations of power and dominance. So when you hear this word phallocentrism, you can interpret this as a critique of the power structure in contemporary American society, in which the male um, seems to make the rules historically. And that's what we refer to as phallocentrism. So it's a political, economic structure, a social structure, cultural structure that is um, built around the male as the dominant figure in a society. More will be said about the phallocentric concept when we get to feminist studies. Okay, so let's move now to apparatus theory. So the apparatus theory is first proposed by Jean-Louis Baudry. Apparatus theory is the earliest psychoanalytic approach to film. This approach claims that the actual environment and machinery of the cinema activates a number of psychoanalytic motivations with the viewers. In his analysis of Plato's famous cave allegory, Baudry points out that the text of the cave may well express a desire inherent in participatory effect of deliberately produced, sought for, and expressed by the cinema. In other words, the same unconscious drives that fuels Plato's writings may have inspired the creation of modern movie theater and the genesis of the film itself. Baudry suggests that all human beings throughout time have experienced the repression of drives of their transformation into desire as a result of psychical development, and film is simply the contemporary means by which we negotiate these mechanisms. So do you remember from philosophy class? If not, go on the YouTube and look for a discussion of the presentation of Plato's allegory of the cave. And this is really a discussion about how we get in this cave is like a movie theater. So Baudry suggests that we go into this theater, and it's a magical experience, like going into a movie theater, especially when you go into these old movie palaces. There's something sacred about this. There's sculptures and there's mosaics, and it's almost like going into a house of worship. And you go into this place, and the lights are dimmed, and it's dark, and there's these big plush seats made with this velvet material. There's always velvet material, and it's like you're going into a womb. You're going into the dream world. It's like you're cuddling up in bed and becoming in this safe space, which allows us, just like psychoanalysis. I mean, think about Freud's, and if any of you get into counseling, you'll know how important the environment is. You can do it, but you're not going to get too far if you have big, bright overhead lights. You have to have a dimming, a darkness, a certain dimming of the lights, a certain I see things get a little darker, a little and when you're using the lights, they're a warmer light, not a bright white light, but something that creates a warmth and a safety and a feeling. And then the person lays down on the couch and closes their eyes, and they free associate. This is a great exercise to do for yourself. You can sit every morning and free associate on a piece of paper. Close your eyes and just write for 3 pages every morning, and free associate whatever comes out, whatever's in your mind, or just say it. But just talk freely, record it. Not for others to listen to or others to read, but for you to reference and understand. It's like kind of like uncluttering the mind. This is something that many artists do. You can even do it musically. Sit down at the instrument and just play, and whatever happens, happens. Well, when you go into a movie theater, Baudry is saying it's like going into this phantasmagoric place where you can fall under hypnosis. enter into the fantasy realm. According to Baudry, the actual context of viewing a movie in a theater reconstructs the situation necessary to the release of the mirror stage discovered by Lacan. The theatrical environment, in other words, plays upon the process of image identification, first enacted in the Lacanian mirror stage. Lacan points out that the child approaching his or her mirror image lacks significant motor control and relies mostly on vision to understand the world. The mirror stage is pleasant and confirming for the child precisely because it displays a false sense of wholeness and control to make up for his lack. Baudry explains that the conventions of the theater, so the giant images on the screen and the passive seated audience, also create a sense of visual dominance and restricted movement, causing viewers again to unconsciously rejoice in mirror stage feelings of wholeness, mastery, and control while watching the film. Think about the phenomenological experience of being in the movie theater. Others are around, but there's a darkness and a privateness and an anonymity that exist. Maybe you're just with your partner in this film, and it can be very intimate in this way. But there's this sense that everybody is in intimacy, like in isolation, but it's a mass isolation. Something very interesting takes place in the theater. Now, I'm going to tell you, as someone who has spent many years attending orchestral and chamber music performances and the opera, the ballet, etc., the theater. This isn't just a phenomenon of a movie palace. This also takes place in the theater, in the jazz club, anywhere where things are creating this ambiance, this atmosphere of the mystical, the magical. And the same thing happens in religious practice, in religious ritual, going into a temple or into a place of worship that's sacred, or even into a forest at dusk. For Baudry, then, the narrative or content of the film is not as appealing as the actual process of viewing, because the spectator identifies less with what is represented, the spectacle itself, than what stages the spectacle make it seen, obliging him to see what it sees. He also draws connection between the movie theater and the womb, claiming that the context for watching a movie in a theater causes viewers to unconsciously regress back to the imagery and pleasurable experience of a connection to the primary caregiver. This assertion may seem odd until we consider the manner in which theater audiences actually watch films. The darkness of the theater and the relative immobility of the audience both suggest aspects that break us from our daily routine and recall womb-like qualities. Think about the womb, even the satiny materials and the softness and the warmth and the quietness and the darkness. Cocoon, if not womb. Christian Metz, another scholar interested in psychoanalytic aspects of the film, agrees with Baudry's basic understanding of the cinematic apparatus and extends it in important ways. Metz recognized the identification as an important component of the apparatus. Now, remember what identification is. Identification is when we see ourselves, we project ourselves into something outside of ourselves. So a character in a film, we'd be identifying with a character in the film. So this is also interesting when you're doing your own understanding what film, what character do you identify with in that film? And how do you identify with them? You could even quite possibly also entertain the idea of why, but not exclusively. Look, how? What is this? And this also gets into voyeurism and fetishism, Freudian concepts of voyeurism and fetishism. We're watching. You're a voyeur when you watch a film. You're watching, especially intimate moments. It might be the shot from think about an image of a film. If you watch Citizen Kane, for example, or maybe one of the David Lynch, Mulholland Drive, or one of these, and there's the Citizen Kane is shot from the position of the child often. The child view is looking up at things, and it creates this psychological reminiscence of childhood while we watch the film. When we're watching a certain intimacy or a murder, and we're looking through the window or through the curtains or through the louvers on a closet door, peeking through as a voyeur. We're forced in the position of voyeur. The fetishism is, listen to this, the conceptual trio of identification, voyeurism, and fetishism provides a foundation of a great deal of psychoanalytic work that was to follow and is important to understanding how each of these notions view the film and the relationship. So the authors then go on to describe identification in this next chapter. This next paragraph, and I'm going to skip to page 185 and focus on an aspect of identification. Scopophilia refers to pleasure that comes from the process of looking. Scopophilia, Freud identifies as one of the manifestations of the sexual drive. Should the aim of a drive deviate from the actually acquiring its object, visual impressions remain the most frequent pathway along the libidinal extinction is aroused. For Metz, derivations of scopophilia like voyeurism and fetishism help explain the draw to the movie theater and a fascination with the film. So voyeurism, or the process of experiencing pleasure by watching a desired object or person from a distance, is a powerful concept at work in the movie theater. Maintaining distance between looker and object is key to the pleasure of voyeurism. And there's almost something sneaky and you have power when you're the voyeur, because if you when we explore the psychological aspects of pornography, we understand that there's this voyeur that looks, but often the female looks with the male gaze, but often the female may look back and acknowledge that you're watching and enjoying that you're watching. And there's a very interesting fetishized voyeuristic effect that's happening there. Metz sees this distinction as a result of the very nature and desire and lack. Now, fetishism, or the psychic structuring of an object or person as a source of sexual pleasure, is another Freudian concept bound to the notion of looking that helps explain the drawl of the cinematic apparatus. For Freud, fetishizing is an important part of navigating the Oedipus complex that helps explain the otherwise inexplicable attraction in later life to objects that many would have deemed non-sexual. In the complex, the child comes to understand for the first time that a power difference exists between mother and the father on the basis of who possesses the phallus. The child thus has two contradictory thoughts. All caretakers are powerful, and some caretakers are more powerful than others. Paraphrasing Freud, Metz claims that a child will retain its former belief beneath the new one, but it will also hold to its new perceptual observation while disavowing it at another level. The knowledge that some can lack the powerful phallus terrifies the child and forces them into imagine the implications if they don't become powerful themselves. So this idea of the phallus, beyond this, people get caught up in the literal ideas of the Oedipus complex, but you have to think about what as Lacan teaches us, we have to think about what this Oedipus complex functions as on a symbolic level. It's about power. It's not about penises. It's about power, right? And in a phallocentric conception, this is the idea that the penis symbolically represents the power, and that things become phallocentrized in this way. Now, this is, as we'll see, this will be further explored when we in our discussion of feminism. As feminism's gone through many transformations from first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. We have a feminism, a post-feminist philosophy now where most feminist scholars actually have come to embrace and explore Freud and rewrite things like such as we'll explore. And Judith Butler is rewriting a psychoanalysis based on the Antigone, on the story of Antigone, rather than on Oedipus, the story of Oedipus. So this is like a feminist psychoanalysis. Karen Horney is another person, and Lou Salome is another, these early feminist psychoanalysts. So whereas first, second wave psychoanalysis was, Freud was the enemy, third wave psychoanalysis actually began tapping into insights of psychoanalysis in a new way. So we'll explore that more in our chapter on feminism. Metz sees, I'm continuing on 186, Metz sees fetishism operating in a cinematic apparatus through a disavowal inherent to the watching process. On the one hand, viewers understand that the objects, characters, and events unfolding in the film before them are not real. On the other hand, quality film will attempt to mimic real life in as much as possible and instill within the viewers a sense of realism. Viewers wrestling with the tension between consciously disavowing the film's truth and unconsciously believing the story is true turn their attention to a fetish to relieve the discomfort. For Metz, the diversionary cinematic fetish is the machinery of the film itself, the director's techniques to help frame the progress of the film. The cinema fetishist, Metz writes, is the person who is enchanted with with what the machine is capable of. Thus, the apparatus is the site where viewers relieve sexual conflicts and anxiety and negotiate these negative feelings again through the process of fetishism. So this sounds bizarre, but think about this in a more concrete way. I hope you think about this in a more concrete way. Have you watched a boxing match? Or a movie, Rocky, or a fight film, and you find yourself cringing and ducking the punch and tension in your body clinging up. Yes, that's the fetishization of the imaginary fiction. This is physically. The next time you have an orgasm by watching pornography, this is exactly the fetishization. This is somehow breaking from the reality principle. You know this isn't real. You know the fight. There's no one there throwing a punch at you. You know you're not having sex with this person, but somehow this distance is, it's going back and forth like this. You know that it's not real, but you're in it. Your body's reacting to it as if it's physiologically real. This is the fetishization of the mechanism. So that is a little bit of an introduction to apparatus theory. Let's see here. I want to bring your attention to the imaginary signifier, Psychoanalysis in the Cinema. This is Indiana University Press by C. Metz, and that is an interesting book if you're interested more in apparatus theory. So we're going to look now at what is the male gaze. Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema is a publication by Laura Mulvey. It's from 1975. Some psychoanalysts begin shifting their attention away from the context of the cinema and focus more on the forms of narrative in the film as well. So the male gaze is the look of desire in a male towards a female. This is, I'm going to add a link for you on our on another link for you to check out. There's something about the gaze. The way, what is a gaze? It's the male gaze is when okay, I'm going to post a video. I'm getting distracted by looking this up to show this to you. My mind just went blank. What is the name of Hitchcock? Okay, so Alfred Hitchcock. Maybe I better save this. When the male gaze one moment. See, this is just like being in the real in the real classroom when your professor is looking something up. When we okay, I'm going to add a link because Alfred Hitchcock in an interview discusses something that really illustrates the male gaze. When we are seeing a film, thanks for remaining patient with me. When we are seeing a film, we see an image, and then we'll see a character, in this case the male, and we'll see them looking in a certain way. And then it'll cut back to the image. And Hitchcock tells us, and he uses this, that depending on the image itself, the way we perceive what theory of mind we call it in cognitive psychology, the way we come to attribute the person's thoughts have to do with what precedes the image of the person looking. So Hitchcock does this demonstration where there's a woman in a bikini laying on a beach towel. And they show the woman on the bikini, then they cut to Alfred Hitchcock, and Hitchcock's just looking. And then they cut back to the lady in the bikini. And then you discuss, well, how do you interpret this? What's Hitchcock thinking? And how's he looking? And the person reads into this desire. They read into it the male gaze, this desire for the woman, the sex drive. So the male gaze is a drive towards power, dominance, and sexual satisfaction over a female that's repeatedly represented in a film. We see this many times, the way the male looks at the female and objectifies the female within the cinema, within an advertisement, within any media we could suggest this to. So this goes back earlier to a film editing technique by Les Kuleshov, who was a Russian filmmaker. And it's known as the Kuleshov effect. And I'm going to post this video for you to watch because I don't have our demonstration here set up that I can easily record the screen. But the Kuleshov effect is Kuleshov in, what year was this? Kuleshov in 1910s, 1920s, early 1900s, when film was just coming in, as he demonstrated how you can simply can manipulate what the person is thinking or interpreting on the film by the sequence of things shown that by editing the film. So first Kuleshov shows a baby in a coffin, a dead baby in a coffin, and then it goes to Kuleshov's face, and then back to the coffin. Then there's a sequence where they're showing a woman, an attractive woman. Kuleshov's same face, and then back to the woman. And then finally a bowl of soup. Kuleshov's face, and then back to the bowl of soup. So in each instance, the stimulus A changes, but the face is exactly the same, and it shows that in each of these we interpret what the gaze, what the facial, what the motivation of the person, what the man's thinking, we attribute that to him based on what he's looking at. This is called the Kuleshov effect. So the male gaze happens when we manipulate the narrative, the viewer, by giving kind of a blank, ambiguous, let's say ambiguous look from the male or the female. It's called the male gaze, but this also happens, there's a female gaze as well, and objectifies the object, the woman or the man or whatever that's being looked at becomes objectified by this gaze. And this is a way to understand what's being suggested on a subtextual level on the power structure of which again brings us into feminism. So a lot of psychoanalysis in the male gaze, the theory of the male gaze, brings us into feminist psychoanalytic studies. There's a great example on page 188, the Nikon ad, where the women are in their underwear playing on a bed. This is a Nikon camera ad, and you can see someone's hand looking, and they're looking directly at us. So you're looking at them, and it's this gaze, this sexual excitement, but they're looking back at you too. They know you're voyeur, you're watching them. So there's this voyeurism, this scopophilia is involved in it as well. The ad on 188 is really fascinating to think about. It's really, they're enjoying that you're playing along with them. And this is an advertisement. Do you really think that this is selling you a camera? There's some other satisfaction that Nikon is tapping into here. And we see this through this ad analysis. Now let's move to page 192 and talk about fantasy theory, our final theoretical approach to psychoanalysis of media. In her 1984 article, Fantasia, Elizabeth Cowie draws upon the work of Freudian scholars Jean Laplanche and Jean-Bertrand Pontalis to explain how psychoanalytic theory may allow for more fluid or mobile processes of identification in films than Mulvey proposes. A fantasy is a mental representation of conscious and unconscious wish fulfillment, and following Freud, Laplanche and Pontalis see it as a primary aspect of mental development. Fantasy is born in the moment that the suckling child begins to gain sexual satisfaction from feeding. Now remember, sexual satisfaction is not adult sexual satisfaction through the genitals. This is meaning transitions. This kind of sexual satisfaction is a transition from a state of anxiety to a state of release. Hunger, anxiety, release. This eventually starts to happen with letting go of the feces or the bladder emptying. I mean, every time I watch my kitten, she goes to the bathroom, and after she goes to the bathroom, she uses the litter box, and then she runs around the house with such bliss and joy. And I think to myself, boy, she must feel really good after getting that tension out of her system. It reminds me of when I worked as a psychotherapist, and people would come in miserable and horrible, like very miserable. And one of the first things I would ask them was a very simple thing: are you having daily bowel movements? And they would look at me like, what? And I'd say, how? And it would turn out that their diet was so poor, eating all this processed junk, and simply by getting them to add fiber to their diet and having a regular evacuation of the system brought them emotional relief. Think about this the next time that you're feeling stomach ache or constipation or things, how it affects your mood and your sense of well-being. Okay, this is what's being talked about. This isn't when the word sexual is being used broadly as a state of release, a state of release, like after you write a good paper, you feel a state of release. After your course has successfully been, you feel good, you've done your work, you're spent, you lay down, you take a long nap. How I'm going to feel after this lecture's over. The child wishes for and fantasizes about being with the object, typically the mother's breast or a bottle, when it is absent. From this understanding, we can assume two qualities of the fantasy. First, wishing creates fantasy, and we fantasize only because we wish for objects of the drive. Second, fantasy is a scene of the drive. It is not the drive in itself, but rather a mental structure that contains the drive and stages and achievement of the object. So think about something when you are in this moment where you lose consciousness during the orgasm. What is the mental image that one locks into? When people study sex and orgasm, they use neuroimaging, they use interview, and what they find is that the individual locks onto a mental image during these moments of sexual excitation before orgasm, and they lock onto this mental image, and this mental image becomes like a fixated point in the mind, and for a brief moment consciousness is lost and they're in that image and the orgasm takes place. This is sex psychology research, but this is what we're talking about: wish fulfillment and craze fantasy. So fantasy also importantly allows us to assume multiple perspectives. For Freud, this ability to identify with multiple perspectives in fantasy comes from the primal or first fantasy, a fantasy about the sexual union of the mother and the father that created us. Now, this doesn't mean fantasy that you want to be a part of it. It's fantasy like imagination. Conscious or unconscious fantasies about this moment involve multiple parties, and in considering the perspective of those parties, we establish a template for all future fantasies. Put another way, a child might fantasize about watching the father and mother engaging in the sexual union that created him or her. And within the fantasy, that child might identify with the father, the mother, his or her own watching the self, another person watching, or various other perspectives. In this light, we can see that fantasy is just as fundamental in the pleasure principle as in other mechanisms of early mental development. Just as many of our drives remain beyond the conscious recognition, however, much of the fantasy we experience as individuals also manifest unconsciously. So in this fantasy, this image, when we see the film, it taps into this idea of a primal fantasy, and this happens in the enclosed state often of the theater. Let's see here. I'm going to page 194. Fantasy theory's basis in narrative and the fluid process of identification represents an attempt to compensate for the perceived limitations of apparatus theory and the ideas regarding the male gaze. Still, Teresa de Lauretis fairly criticizes this approach for overlooking some key discrepancies in psychoanalytic fantasy. And she writes, first, a particular fantasy scenario, regardless of its artistic, formal, or aesthetic excellence, is filmic representation, is not automatically accessible to every spectator. A film may work as a fantasy for some spectators, but not as others. Second, and conversely, the spectator's own socio-political location and psychosexual configuration have much to do with whether or not the film can work for her as a scenario of desire and what Freud would call visualization of the subject herself as the subject of the fantasy. That is to say, whether the film can engage her spectatorial desire or literally whether she can see herself in it. So it may vary from person to person, film to film, which of course is what we look at in projection. The person is just like an ink blot projecting themselves onto the film, and certain films might be more suited to, or maybe different films tap into different fantasies within ourselves. So to conclude, I would say that when you go to the art gallery and you look at a piece of art and you describe it, you and your friend go to the art gallery and describe this piece of art. You're speculating. You're seeing a speculum as a mirror. When you speculate, you're looking at a reflection of yourself. So what you're describing in that piece of art describes more about you than it does about the work of art. And this is why you and your friend can both look and project yourselves onto this art and either agree or disagree or have nuanced differences about what you see. Two people can go to a film and see two different films. Why? Because we are projecting ourselves onto that film. We're speculating. When we leave the film, when you read the review, you learn more about the reviewer than you do about the film. Okay, so this is that's what I'm going to talk. I'm done talking about this now, and I suggest that you read this and know about this and revisit it if it doesn't make sense. You may have to reread and watch the videos and do your best with making sense out of this. It might be something that makes sense years from now for you. Thank you for your time.